Think modern dinner party etiquette is stressful? Try navigating a Victorian dinner party. In the elegant dining rooms of 19th century Britain, dinner was a carefully choreographed performance where one wrong move could ruin your social standing. Rules governed everything from how you entered the room to which topics you could discuss. Miss a signal, use the wrong fork, or speak out of turn, and you might never receive another invitation. This was dining as social warfare, where the upper and middle classes used elaborate rules to separate themselves from those below. The food was just part of it. The real test was knowing how to behave. Let's step into the dining room and see what rules you'd need to survive a Victorian dinner party. The strict seating hierarchy. You couldn't just sit wherever you wanted at a Victorian dinner party. Seating was determined by strict social rank, and getting it wrong was a serious breach of etiquette. The host and hostess sat at opposite ends of the table. The most important guests sat to their right. From there, everyone was arranged in descending order of importance, alternating male and female. De Brett's and Burke's peerage were consulted to determine who outranked whom. A baronet outranked a knight, who outranked a gentleman with no title. Your placement told everyone exactly where you stood socially. Being seated far from the host meant you were considered less important. Married couples were separated unless newlywed, forcing guests to make conversation with people they might not know well. Start eating immediately. Here's one that surprises people. Victorians expected you to begin eating as soon as you were served. Waiting for others was considered old-fashioned and ill-bred. Victorian etiquette books stated, "As soon as you are helped, begin to eat," or if the viands are too hot for your palate, take up your knife and fork and appear to begin. To wait for others is now not only old-fashioned but ill-bred. This is the opposite of modern etiquette. The Victorian logic was that waiting meant the first people served would have cold food. However, you still needed to avoid eating so slowly that you held up the table. The balance required constant attention. No discussing business, politics, or religion. Victorian dinner conversation followed strict rules about appropriate topics. Business talk was vulgar. Politics was too controversial. Religion was too personal. Acceptable topics included the weather, social events, theatre, books, and light gossip. Victorian manuals published lists of suitable subjects, essentially safe, bland topics unlikely to spark debate. Women faced even stricter limitations. They should be charming but never too intellectual. Victorian guides warned against excessive displays of learning that might make male guests uncomfortable. Polite acknowledgement of servants. The etiquette around acknowledging servants was subtle and specific. Victorian etiquette books instructed guests to thank servants politely, but quietly. One 1889 guide stated, "By all means thank a servant for replacing a dropped napkin, a knife or fork. However, it should be done in a low tone without making a show of it. A simple thank you spoken quietly or a gracious nod was appropriate. What was improper was having conversations with servants or giving them audible directions during dinner. The key was acknowledging service without disrupting conversation. Ladies withdrew after dinner. At the end of the meal, the hostess would catch the eye of the senior female guest and rise. This was the signal for all women to leave the dining room, retiring to the drawing room for tea. The men remained at the table for port, cigars, and conversation for 30 to 45 minutes. This allowed them to discuss business and politics, the topics forbidden during dinner. The withdrawal was also a test of social knowledge. Rising too early or too late marked you as unfamiliar with proper form. This practice continued well into the 20th century. The finger bowl protocol. Finger bowls appeared after certain courses, containing warm water sometimes scented with lemon or rose petals. The proper technique? Dip only your fingertips, one hand at a time. Pat them dry on your napkin. Never wash your entire hand. Never use both hands simultaneously, and certainly never drink from it. Victorian manuals devoted considerable space to finger bowl protocol, suggesting it was a common source of confusion. The finger bowl became a class marker. Knowing how to use it properly proved you'd dined in elegant homes before. Complex glove rules. Women wore gloves to Victorian dinner parties, but removing them involved confusing protocol. By the late Victorian period, women kept gloves on until seated, then removed them discreetly and placed them in their lap under the napkin. One 1843 etiquette book stated, "At the time of taking refreshment, of course, they must be taken off. No well-educated person would eat in gloves." However, customs varied by household. Men's rules were simpler. Gloves were removed in the entrance hall and never brought into the dining room. Directional service rules. Victorian table service followed specific directional patterns. Dishes were presented from your left and removed from your right. Wine was poured from your right. You passed dishes to the right. These rules created choreographed flow around the table. But you were expected to know them instinctively and never appear to think about them. When a servant presented a dish, you needed to serve yourself an appropriate portion. Not too much, which appeared greedy, not too little, which suggested inadequate food. This unconscious grace could only come from extensive practice. Napkin signals. Your napkin was a communication device with its own rules. You unfolded it partially when the hostess did the same. You never tucked it into your collar like a bib. During the meal you touched the napkin to your lips occasionally, but never wiped aggressively. At meal's end you placed it loosely on the table, never refolding it neatly, as that suggested the napkin was clean enough to be used again. The napkin also signaled intentions. Placing it on your chair meant you'd return. On the table meant you were finished. Moderate commentary on food. While Victorians weren't forbidden from commenting on food entirely, excessive praise or criticism was poor form. The expectation was that food would naturally be excellent, so overly enthusiastic compliments suggested surprise. Victorian guides advised against overly commenting on the food, including both particular praise or criticism. You could indicate enjoyment through actions, eating with pleasure, accepting seconds. The rule had a practical basis. The hostess hadn't prepared the food herself. Her cook had. Extended discussion might give servants ideas above their station. Arrive 15 minutes late. Victorian dinner guests were expected to arrive exactly 15 minutes after the stated time. This gave the host final preparation time and ensured everyone arrived within a small window. Arriving exactly on time was considered rude. It suggested you were too eager or didn't understand proper form. Arriving more than 15 minutes late was equally offensive, as it disrupted the carefully timed meal service. This punctuality rule applied specifically to dinner parties. Other social occasions had different timing expectations, and knowing which rule applied to which event was part of demonstrating social competence. The procession into dinner. Moving from the drawing room to the dining room was a ceremonious procession, not a casual walk. Before dinner was announced, the hostess would discreetly inform each gentleman which lady he would escort. When the servant announced dinner, couples processed into the dining room in order of social precedence, the most honored guests first, the host and hostess last. Getting this order wrong could create serious offense. The hostess had to carefully organize the procession, which became complicated with single people or widows. This formal entrance set the tone for the entire evening. Conversation timing. Victorian dinner conversation required careful timing. You needed to be interesting, but not dominating. Respond when addressed, but don't speak too much unasked. Long stories were risky. Etiquette guides specifically advised against beginning anecdotes that couldn't be completed before plates were cleared. This created a particular style of dinner talk, quick, witty, and superficial. The most valued guests could tell an amusing story in a few sentences or deliver a perfectly timed quip. The skill was being engaging without being overbearing. Never blow on hot food. If your food was too hot, you simply had to wait until it cooled. Blowing on your food was considered distasteful and showed a lack of patience and refinement. Victorian etiquette emphasized appearing composed and unhurried. Blowing on food suggested you were too eager to eat, which was seen as somewhat piggish. The expectation was that well-bred people could wait calmly for food to reach an appropriate temperature. This rule applied to all foods and drinks. If your soup or tea was too hot, you set it aside briefly and continued conversation until it cooled naturally. The departure timing. Knowing when to leave was as important as knowing how to behave. Victorian etiquette books specified that guests were expected to linger for 2 or 3 hours after the dinner, and no one may politely depart until at least 1 hour has passed. The senior female guest would make subtle preparations to leave, and others would follow her lead. The hostess gave subtle signals when ready for guests to depart, calling for coats, shifting towards the door. Reading these signals required experience. Overstaying your welcome could mean not receiving another invitation. Within 1 week, you were required to pay a brief dinner call to thank your hosts. So what were Victorian dinner parties really like? They were elaborate performances where social standing was tested through countless small rules. The next time you stress about modern dinner etiquette, remember, at least you don't have to calculate your conversation timing by course, or worry about whether your glove removal was properly subtle. Which of these rules surprises you most? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this look at Victorian social customs, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more stories about how people really lived and stressed in the past. Thanks for watching.